Scotland may well be one of the dreamiest places on earth, but to do it justice, there's certain mistakes and must-knows to keep in mind. Hi, I'm Christina from happytowander.com, and I recently spent a month in Scotland, mainly around Edinburgh for festival season. I still have so much of Scotland to see, but in this video, I'm going to be sharing all sorts of tips and must-knows that I wish I had before my first visit. So I hope you find them helpful. Let's get started with some basic Scotland must-knows and travel planning tips. We'll start with a simple but very important distinction. Scotland is located in the northern portion of the island of Great Britain. It is part of the United Kingdom, but culturally it is incredibly distinct from England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which means when you're in Scotland, remember to keep in mind that you are talking about Scottish culture and Scottish accents, so don't call them English and don't refer to their accents as British. In terms of arriving in Scotland, there are 5 main international airports: Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Glasgow Prestwick, and Inverness. But Edinburgh Airport is the most common point of entry for visitors from overseas. Now, in terms of where to go, you should know that Scotland is filled with so many amazing places to see. To get the most of your experience, I would really recommend doing a combination of cities and nature, as well as famous hotspots and places that are a bit more off the beaten path. While most first-time visitors usually do a combination of Edinburgh, the Highlands, and sometimes Glasgow, that's only a very small portion of the entire country, which the official tourism authority divides into over a dozen different regions. So, how can you find places that are a bit more off the beaten path? Well, my first recommendation is simply picking a smaller area and exploring it more in depth. The truth is, there are loads of famous places in Scotland like the Isle of Skye or Loch Ness. But if you do your research, you're very likely to find alternatives to famous islands, lochs, and castles closer to your chosen base. Loch Ness, for instance, is only one of literally over 30,000 different lochs in Scotland. So sticking to a smaller area will not only save you money, but also encourage you to find more hidden gems of your own. I would also recommend consuming content from content creators based in Scotland, because at the end of the day, if they live there, they're going to have a lot more information about more offbeat places compared to people who are visiting maybe for a week or two. Some local creators I can highly recommend include Watch Me See and also The Wayfaring Kiwi. All that said, it's important to note that while public transportation with buses and trains is really good between cities and within cities in Scotland, you will need a car if you want to explore Scotland's nature and countryside in depth. Within Scotland, there are a number of really famous and really gorgeous road trips, like the North Coast 500, the Northeast 250, and many, many more. Plus, having a car will just allow you to see a lot more on your own schedule. We personally didn't have a car during our time in Scotland because we were mainly staying in Edinburgh. And while we were able to see a lot of really beautiful nature spots and places in the countryside through booking day tours, the truth is that did restrict us to the most famous and most touristy places, which of course is fine because these places are famous for a reason. But if you're someone who's actively looking to avoid crowds and maybe get a bit more off the beaten path, then definitely having a car is the way to go. If you do rent a car though, be sure to prepare yourself for driving in Scotland. Apart from driving on the left side, roads can be quite narrow and regulations might be different from what you're used to. The legal alcohol limit in Scotland, for instance, is actually stricter than other parts of the UK, which can catch some visitors off guard if they're just looking to have a beer with lunch or something like that. So be sure to read up on the different regulations before you set out driving in Scotland. In terms of when to go, know that summer is definitely peak season, especially in and around August, particularly in Edinburgh when the entire city comes alive for festival season. There's also other fun summer events across the country like the Highland Games, and in the wintertime there's plenty of fun winter festivals as well, including Hogmanay, the country's very famous New Year's celebrations. This is why you should book as far in advance as possible for peak periods like summer and Christmas, if the goal is to experience some of these cultural events. If, however, you're looking to avoid the crowds, then consider visiting in shoulder seasons like fall or spring. In any case, booking ahead in Scotland is always a good idea. This is because some of the more touristy places like Inverness are quite small and don't have a lot of accommodation choices compared to larger cities, so the earlier you book, the better. And for the last tip in this section, make sure you leave some space in your luggage. The truth is, when you go to Scotland, there are a lot of really cool souvenirs, but a lot of them can be quite bulky, like things made out of wool, for instance. So make sure you leave some space in your luggage for these souvenirs, or do the classic bag within a bag nesting trick, so you only have to pay for one bag on your way back home. All right, now let's move on to Scotland tips for food and drink. Food-wise, definitely don't be afraid to try some classic Scottish specialties. Haggis is a famous one that requires zero introduction. Definitely keep an open mind and don't Google it before you try it. They're also typically served with the neeps and tatties, which are another Scottish specialty consisting of mashed potato and mashed turnip. Another really good one to try is Cullen skink, which is a creamy fish soup. There's also chicken tikka masala, which is marinated chicken in a spiced tomato-based sauce. Fun fact, this is actually a national dish of the UK, and some credit its invention to a chef from Glasgow. There's also shortbread, the buttery cookie that's beloved across the world. And if you want to try something a little more gluttonous, Scottish chippies have a bit of a reputation for being able to deep fry pretty much anything, from pizza to Mars bars, so be sure to give those a try if you're looking for something crunchy. Many takeaway places also do something called a munchie box, which consists of fast food, all different types, kind of just thrown into a pizza box. It's a fun novelty, but definitely don't have it too much. Now, another important tip to keep in mind is to try whiskey. There are a few important considerations when it comes to whiskey, however. First of all, know that when you're ordering it, never call it a scotch. Be sure to just order a whiskey, and you're never ordering a shot of it. It's always a dram, so ask for a dram of whiskey. And if you're feeling overwhelmed with the selection, which is pretty inevitable, a really good rule of thumb is to simply ask the bartender for some recommendations. That said, don't just ask them, what kind of whiskey do you recommend? Because there's a lot of different varieties, and it's kind of like walking into a restaurant and being like, what is a food you recommend? It obviously does depend on your taste quite a bit, so before you ask for the recommendations, kind of have some taste profiles in mind of what you tend to prefer. Generally, some of the taste profiles involved in whiskey include smokiness, fruitiness, nuttiness, peatiness, and how floral it is. So be prepared with some of your preferences in those regards, and then they'll be able to give you a very solid recommendation. It goes without saying though, try not to ask for recommendations if the bar is really busy. If they're up to their eyeballs in orders, it's probably not a good time to be picking their brains about whiskey recommendations. And lastly, this is unlikely to become relevant as a tourist, but just keep in mind that whiskey in Scotland is spelled without the E. Whiskey with the E refers to whiskey from Ireland, and we don't talk about her here. Now, if you are interested in whiskey, one experience I can highly recommend is either booking a whiskey distillery tour or booking some kind of whiskey experience where you learn a bit more about the drink. Because to be honest, I didn't really know how to appreciate whiskey before I did some of these demos, and now I feel like I can really understand it a lot more, so having that context is quite important. Luckily, there's over 100 distilleries in Scotland, many of which offer tours, so you really have your pick. It's quite touristy, but I also really enjoyed the Johnny Walker experience in Edinburgh. It's kind of like a Willy Wonka-fied version of a whiskey tour. It's not of a distillery, but it's really fun, and you do get to learn a lot more about whiskey itself, so I can highly recommend that. That said, be sure to try gin and other tipples as well. I was very pleasantly surprised during my month in Scotland to see that gin is actually a pretty big deal there. In fact, 70% of the UK's gin is actually made in Scotland, so that's your excuse to try some gin while you're there as well, just in the name of cultural appreciation. The craft beer scene is also growing pretty rapidly, so be sure to diversify. And of course, in the realm of soft drinks, I have to give a shout out to Iron Brew. In fact, one of my favorite fun facts is that in the entire world, there are only a handful of countries where Coca-Cola isn't the #1 selling soft drink, and Scotland is one of them. In Scotland, Iron Brew is the soda of choice, and its taste is really hard to describe, so I would say just make sure you get one. It's bright orange, it's very eye-catching. Be sure to try one while you're there because it's one of those things that is just quintessentially Scottish. Now, dining out can get pricey if you're doing it every single day, so if you're just looking for a quick meal on the go, one really easy way to save money while you're in Scotland is getting a meal deal. Meal deals are a staple of UK chains where you basically get a main, a snack, and a drink for a set price, usually under £5. So it's a really good budget-friendly alternative if you're just looking for a quick bite, especially if you're on a road trip or you're looking to picnic and you don't want to waste time or money sitting down in a restaurant. And as a quick final food tip, beware of seagulls, okay? If you're eating fish and chips, if you're eating anything outdoors, seagulls will not hesitate to come steal your food, so you've been warned. All right, now let's move on to some culture and etiquette tips for Scotland. First of all, don't assume that all of Scotland is just about kilts and bagpipes. In touristy areas in Scotland, they really do ham things up for tourists, so you are going to see a lot of tartan, a lot of bagpipes, and a lot of kilts. But the truth is, Scotland is a modern country, so be sure to experience that side of Scotland as well, in addition to all the fun touristy stuff. Language-wise, you will be 100% fine with English. Just know that depending on where you are, you might encounter some Scots or some Gaelic, which you're gonna see on road signs. Now, take note that while they are spelled the same, Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic are actually two separate languages. Yes, they did come from the same source, but over time they have become quite distinct, so just keep in mind that they're not the same. And while as a tourist you're not really going to need to learn Scots or Gaelic to get by, there are certain pieces of vocabulary that have made their way into place names that I do think are important to keep in mind, so here are just a few. Loch, for instance, is lake. Ben refers to peaks or mountains. Glen refers to valleys. And the Gaelic name for Scotland is Alba, which you'll see in quite a few places, including in the localized version of the BBC, which is BBC Alba. Another fun piece of vocabulary to know is Munro, which refers to mountains that are over 3,000 feet tall. Now, this word doesn't come from Scots or Gaelic, it actually comes from Sir Hugh Munro, who famously published a list of Scotland's tallest mountains. Hardcore people these days actually make a hobby out of bagging Munros, which means climbing to the top of these very high mountains. There's 282 of them, and the current record holder is a badass woman known as Jamie Aarons, who bagged all 282 Munros in 31 days. Now, if you're not up for bagging Munros, a more feasible goal might be to simply learn how to pronounce names properly. If you've made it this far, odds are you've heard me pronounce a place name that didn't quite sound like how you've always read it. And that's fair, because a lot of these names aren't actually pronounced like how they're spelled in English. So to catch you up to speed, here are a few really common mistakes to keep in mind. For instance, there's Edinburgh, which is pronounced Edinburgh and not Edinburgh, Edinburgh, or Edinburgh. There's also Glasgow, which is pronounced like Glasgow and not Glasgow or Glascow. And for my fellow Outlander fans, there's a town you should visit called Curris, but it's spelled like Colross, but it's not pronounced like that. And that's just barely scraping the surface. So the key really is to just listen out for how locals pronounce place names, whether that's your taxi driver, your tour guide, or even the announcements on the train. Just keep in mind, of course, there's some room for variation because of accents, but generally speaking, try to pronounce it correctly. Even if you don't, it's not the end of the world because Scottish people are very friendly and very forgiving. Just give it your best try. Now, on a related note, I would say if you're not used to it, the Scottish accent can be quite challenging to understand at first. So a really good way to kind of get used to the Scottish accent and some of the vocabulary that they use in Scotland is to simply watch TV shows or movies that are set in Scotland. So I'll fire off a few quick recommendations. Obviously, there's Outlander if you are into that kind of thing. But if you're looking for something that provides a bit more historical context in addition to some beautiful landscapes, then I can also recommend Mary Queen of Scots as well as The Outlaw King. This might be a good time to mention as well that Braveheart is not at all historically accurate and also mostly filmed in Ireland. All right, now finally, let's cover some tips for when you arrive in Scotland. First off, do carry a bit of cash, especially coins. I noticed that when I was in a few places like Inverness, a lot of the public toilets did require a very small fee of 10p or 20p. So if you don't have any coins on you, it might be kind of difficult to use these public toilets, so make sure you have a bit of cash, especially coins. That said, you don't need too much cash because most places do take contactless card payments now. Plus, do beware of the fact that Scotland does use pounds like the rest of the UK, but they have their own unique Scottish banknotes. And so you can use English pounds all throughout Scotland, but do withdraw Scottish pounds kind of sparingly, just because in other parts of the UK, they can be a bit funny about accepting Scottish notes, even though they are technically legal tender and they should accept them. Some places would be a bit funny about that, so just keep that in mind. Now, in terms of tipping, tips aren't mandatory in Scotland, but it is customary to leave a tip of about 10% in restaurants if you thought you had good service. Another very important tip is to not stop in the middle of the sidewalk, aka pavement, to take photos. Having experienced this way too many times during my month in Edinburgh, I can definitely see why this is a very hot topic for local rage. Scotland is beautiful and you will feel compelled to take a photo every 3 seconds, but just make sure that you do that by pulling over first, standing to the side, and making sure you're not disrupting the flow of foot traffic, because that can get really annoying. Now, another tip that I learned from hard experience is to prepare for all kinds of weather. Scottish weather is notoriously gloomy and moody and can change just like that. Even if you're visiting in the summer, don't expect summer weather every day. I spent August in Scotland and I basically had a coat on every single day while I was there. So be sure to prepare for this by packing different layers that can be removed or put on according to the weather conditions. I would definitely prioritize a good waterproof and windproof jacket over bringing an umbrella, simply because a lot of the time Scottish rain is accompanied by Scottish wind, and your umbrella is no match for that. Lastly, do avoid the cheap souvenir shops that you see in a lot of the touristy areas in Scotland. Most of the time, the stuff they're selling you isn't of a very good quality, and if you're looking for something that's gonna last a long time, like you're looking for a nice tartan scarf, be sure to visit an independent shop that actually has good handmade stuff, and that's more likely to last you a lifetime than something that's made out of polyester. The same goes for other souvenirs as well. Finding an independent shop stocked with local makers means you're more likely to find some unique and long-lasting souvenirs to bring home. And I have to say, at the end of the day, just wear whatever makes you happy, but one thing that I would avoid is buying those tartan berets that they sell in the souvenir shops that have the red hair coming out of them. I really don't understand why these exist, much less why people buy them and wear them around town. They're super silly. Obviously, Scottish people don't wear hats like that, and I just think they look a bit dumb. And the same goes for cheap souvenir shop kilts. I don't really foresee any situation that necessitates a tourist wearing a kilt walking around town, because at the end of the day, this isn't standard day-to-day Scottish wear, so you're not gonna see a bunch of Scottish people wearing kilts on the street, and as a tourist, it just doesn't really make sense for you to wear one. But again, you do you. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope these Scottish travel tips were helpful, and for more practical travel videos just like this one, be sure to like and subscribe for more. I'll see you guys next week. Bye!